This lecture will take a look at the urban West, cities and urbanization in the American West. We want to identify influencing factors of urbanization in the American West and examine the evolution of Western urban areas. So to begin, when we take a look at the American West, if you go and you watch movies, a lot of times it shows people living on ranches, people living on farms. Basically, everything seems isolated. This isn't the case with the American West, though. Cities were and always have been, still are today, an important characteristic of human life in this area. If we went back to, say, the Anasazi, the southwestern cultures, for example, before contact, you had the cliff dwellings where people were coming together, where they were living in large, permanent, sedentary structures that they put a lot of thought in terms of the outlay, in terms of defense, in terms of making sure that they were close to trade routes. Same thing's true if you go down to Mesoamerica. If you take a look at the Mississippian cultures, they did live, sedentary cultures of the native society did live in permanent places, permanent villages. Semi-nomadic people that we found in, say, the Great Plains, they would have their permanent dwellings in key places with resources for part of the year, and then they would leave them for hunting the rest. It was really just the nomadic people where they retained a very mobile lifestyle. So this idea that the West is not an urban area is really a misconception of the American West. So when we take a look at the policy of city building under the Americans, there's a number of things that we got to take a look at in urban Western history. We need to understand, resources, transportation, geography, strategic needs, all in the history of the development of cities. So first off, in terms of resources, when cities were developed, usually they were close to key resources. And these were resources that, were actually there, that were Native Americans had relied on prior to the arrival of Americans. One thing that historians have and geographers have determined as a result of studies is that Americans oftentimes built over native places in terms of sedentary communities. The same places that were ideal in terms of resources, firewood, water, agricultural soil, other things that humans needed. These were areas that Native Americans relied on, and then Americans came behind them and usually built on top of that. So when Americans went out into the American West and started developing cities, that resources were a key element. So if we take a look at, say, Denver, Colorado, why Denver? Why there? Why not somewhere else? Well, you just got to take a look at the fact that it's right there on that front range. You have access to plains. It's plains geography in the eastern section of where they were located in the city, where you can grow your crops and raise livestock. You do have the mountains to the west. That's where, of course, Pikes Peak was with the gold that they were going there to mine. It's where, usually you would find your sources of timber, other types of building needs. So it was right there on that perfect little area. And this is, true with a number of other cities as well. So, if you take a look at Omaha, it's right there along the Missouri River. It's, perfect in terms of transportation. It's got timber, again, agricultural soil, just a number of things that made it ideal for settlement. Another thing that people usually paid attention to was transportation, migratory routes. If you went into places like, say, Fort Bridger or Fort Boise, why there? Well, it's real basic. It was a key spot along the Oregon Trail that people would eventually stop to read provision at. Some of these forts also, eventually would replace like the rendezvous for fur traders to come and unload their cargo, pick up new supplies, and then head back off to hunt and trap for more furs. If you take a look at, say, Santa Fe and Taos, they were in key areas along the Rio Grande, which provided a great means of transportation through, southern Texas, southern New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Other cities that, if we take a look at transportation, Omaha and Independence, Missouri. Independence, Missouri initially was the key starting point for Western migrations. It remained so even after the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad, and was really just replaced by Omaha once that railroad was built. And so Omaha, if we take a look at it, it owes its existence to the Transcontinental Railroad, which basically followed the Platte River, which was the main kind of highway for the Oregon Trail. Same thing's true when we take a look at, say, Salt Lake City. The Mormons initially established Salt Lake City as a way to get away from American control and prejudice, and usually like attacks on their communities. But following discovery of gold, following this kind of boom in American settlement, especially after the Mexican-American War, in lands far along the western seaboard, Salt Lake City suddenly became a major stopping point for people on their western migratory routes. Of course, there's just geography. Where do all of these elements come together? Some of the key cities today in the American West. That's where you had the resources, the transportation routes, all of these factors that just really made it ideal. So you got to look at the totality of it. Now, after World War II, another thing that would come to factor into this would be strategic needs. Following the first detonations of the atomic bomb in New Mexico at Los Alamos, the Trinity experiments, the American West would become a major place for the testing of nuclear missiles. It became the site where a lot of nuclear weapons and silos were developed. So if you look at, say, Minot, North Dakota, why Minot? Well, Minot just so happened to house, some of the American military bases that were in charge of these weapons of mass destruction. These were lands with, a lot of area, a lot of space, perfect for military needs. And so American military bases, really came to dominate lands in the American West, especially considering the fact that the federal government controlled most of these lands to begin with. If we take a look at Alaska, of course, was that connection between, eastern Russia and western United States. It provides, the Air Force today with a lot of, airspace that they can operate out of. If you take a look at Hawaii, well, there's your key point in our entire defense of the Pacific Ocean. So our bases, our forward bases in Okinawa, in Guam, Samoa, they are connected and anchored at Honolulu, which provides that connection to the Western. So, after World War II, military needs really kind of came into play for this. So if you want an example of, what to look for when it comes to developing, cities, especially in the American West, a good book is William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis. He takes a look at Chicago, which usually is a little bit east of the American West, we consider, but still Chicago was an important point, connection point to the West. But he goes through and he takes a look at the development of Chicago, and he connects all of these factors together in, the rapid development of the city. So if you want to do further studies in this area, it's a perfect book to use as an example. Some other factors in terms of urbanization. When you look at Western urbanization, you cannot study the process without studying boosters. Boosters are is the name that we give to people that promoted urban development and Western settlement. And there were a number of different boosters. First off, you had your railroads. If you take a look at this map here, this is a map from the Library of Congress of the Union Pacific Land Grants. And what you'll find on this map that was made in 1872 are the names of some principal Nebraskan cities like Grand Island and Kearney, which today, provide centers of settlement in a state where most people live in two cities, Lincoln and Omaha. So when it came to the railroads, how were they going to get their money back for this massive investment in this huge construction project? Well, one was through rates and passenger fares, but most of it was going to come in the form of land sales. So they were very interested in getting people to move west and to settle on these lands. Speculators are really big. Just as it happened in colonial times, usually some of the first people to start making major land purchases in the West were people that were purchasing it for cheap prices from the federal government, and then their idea was to turn around and sell it for a killing to farmers, ranchers, and townspeople as the population grew. Town developers were really big. So if you look at, say, Denver, Colorado, some of the first people to go out to the mining camps at the base of Pikes Peak in the future location of Denver, Colorado, were town developers who also fused in with their business of speculation. So they would go out there, they would try to get claims to this land, and then afterwards they would plan and start to lay out and map out and design cities that would eventually, they would try to get territorial legislatures to support and Congress to support, because if they could make that like the principal city, then their holdings, their assets would explode in value. Of course, the federal and state governments were really big promoters of Western settlement. Kansas, after the American Civil War, oftentimes advertised to African American communities as a new Eden, a place to get away from that old system that they lived under and to start their lands fresh, which many took advantage of. Federal government was a huge promoter, especially if you take a look at, say, the Homestead Act of 1862. Then finally, the tourist industry, especially after World War II, played a major role. So if we look at Honolulu, prior to World War II, it was kind of a sleepy little town. It had Pearl Harbor, this major naval base. It hadn't really grown into the huge city that it is today. If you take a look at Honolulu today, it's where most of the people in Hawaii live. That was largely the result of tourism. It made Honolulu a hot spot almost overnight, especially after Hollywood latched onto it, and you had the likes of Elvis Presley making these films like Blue Hawaii that just made it this place people wanted to go to. You can take a look at Las Vegas, same thing, sleepy little city turned into gambling, the home of the gambling industry today, where people go to get away because what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. So you can go throughout in the American West and find a lot of these places that, market to a certain niche of the tourist industry. So when you take a look at urban morphology in the American West, in terms of, usually geographers always try to start with what kind of urban model does it fit? Was there, a lot of planning ahead of time? Did they try to use zoning laws to promote development in an orderly fashion, or is it something different? In terms of urban morphology, there are different urban models. If you go down into parts of Texas, in New Mexico, you can still find that very, Spanish influenced design where you have the city's central plaza that's, surrounded by, churches and government buildings, these important structures, and then, your residential kind of moves out from it. So you will find some kind of like planned communities, if you will, and you will find foreign influences in city development. Generally, though, with the American West, these are lands that usually are subject to a lot of urban sprawl. So it's just this kind of unrestrained growth of cities. Um, and usually there's no one central nucleus of the city. It follows the what we call the multiple nuclei model, where there's different zones, each one having its own function within the city. So you might have your central business district in one part of the city, an area that caters to the maybe a college that's located there, some industrial areas scattered here and there with residential, throughout it. So, it'd be more like the Harris-Ullman multiple nuclei model that it would follow here in terms of how they're designed, how they're laid out, but a lot of sprawl. And this can cause some serious issues. So if you look at Los Angeles today, what's the one big issue that they have, especially after the suburbanization of the 1950s? Well, it's traffic, it's congestion, it's maintaining roads where you'll hear occasionally of Carmageddon happening, where they decide to fix one highway, and the next thing you know, the whole town's in a panic because how are we going to get to work now? It's one little construction project can basically shut down and just affect massive amounts of traffic. In terms of Western development, initially on American cities in this area tended to be pretty homogenous in terms of ethnic makeup, with Euro-Americans being the dominant groups. Not always the case, keep in mind. Parts of Texas, parts of California, you had a large Latin American population. California did have Asian American migrants coming in there, especially in the late 1800s. And so these areas, experience segregation. It's just that it may or may not have been, like the South in terms of it being like legally enshrined. But we do actually see that pattern. So in California, for example, there were, number of instances of segregation where, the laws were written in such a way or executed in such a way that it was discriminatory against Asian Americans. So John Wonder of University of Nebraska did some great studies in this area where, he took a look at, say, court cases where Asian Americans were unable to testify because they couldn't swear to God because, they were Buddhist or Confucian. They didn't follow Christianity. So segregation did apply to them, whether it was, legally written in like we have with the Jim Crow's laws of the American South, or whether it was more towards like other social conventions like covenant neighborhoods. We did see that in the American West, so that was a presence. We do see the development of ethnic neighborhoods in the American West. Immigrants, just as they did on the Eastern Coast as they came in, tended to move into neighborhoods together as a form of, to develop community, to provide, help to each other. And we have the remnants of many of these ethnic neighborhoods today. We have examples of Chinatowns in California, just as you have them in New York City. If you go up into, say, Vancouver, in Canada, they had the Punjab market. They had a lot of South Asian migrants into Vancouver, and they, experienced segregation, developed ethnic neighborhoods. So you do see that pattern that's similar in other areas of the United States. And today, there are traces of so what we call spaces of consumption, parts of cities that are devoted towards tourism or certain types of entertainment activity as a way of drawing in revenue. So Hollywood, for example, definitely caters to tourists coming out to the Los Angeles area. You have Las Vegas, of course, with the Strip. that's all about tourism and gambling and hotels and convention centers. Um, so again, some other similarities that are shared with other parts of the country. So we take a look at the American West. It is a place of resource extraction. It was a place of ranching and farming. It was an area where, or it is an area where the federal government still owns a lot of lands. Designates them as national grasslands and timberlands. But it is also a place of cities, and has been for some time, and will for the foreseeable future.